Welcome to Discover Before Sleep channel. Tonight, we explore the moment humanity looked beyond the naked eye. For centuries, Earth was believed to be the center. The ground was still. The stars were distant. Then one quiet night, glass revealed a terrible truth. The sky was not empty, and we were not the center. This is the story of how seeing changed everything and opened the door to the infinite. So take a breath, let the world fade, and step beyond the stars. Now let's begin. The air inside the workshop was thick, not with the scent of wood or iron, but with the suffocating, chalky breath of pulverized silica and fine sand. It was a suspended fog that caught the amber shafts of the late afternoon sun, turning the cramped room into a cathedral of dust. Hans moved with the practiced, agonizing slowness of a man who knew that a single heartbeat of impatience could shatter weeks of labor. His hands, calloused and stained gray from the polishing slurries, gripped a small disc of green-tinted glass. It was imperfect, birthed from a crucible of roaring heat and wood smoke, yet it held within its translucent body the potential to betray the very nature of human sight. He leaned over the grinding bench, his spine curved like a bow. Before him sat a shallow stone bowl, lined with a mixture of emery and water. The sound was rhythmic, a low, guttural shush 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 that vibrated through the bones of his arms and settled in his teeth. This was the labor of the unseen. To the world outside the heavy oak door, the glass was merely a bead, a bauble for a nobleman's spectacles or a crude window to keep out the winter gale. But Hans felt the glass, changing. Under his palms, the flat, jagged edges were being surrendered to the curve. He was carving a shape that did not exist in the natural geometry of the eye, a curve so precise it felt like a secret being whispered from the stone to the glass. Every few minutes, he would lift the disc, rinsing it in a bucket of stale water. He held it up to the singular candle flickering on the wall, watching how the flame danced across the surface. At first, the reflection was a chaotic smear, a ghost of light lost in the scratches. But as the hours bled into the evening, the scratches began to vanish, the surface smoothed into a liquid stillness. He began to use finer and finer silts, moving from the coarse bite of crushed rock to the soft, velvet touch of jeweler's rouge. The transition was emotional, a slow shedding of the physical world. He was no longer working with glass. He was working with the behavior of reality itself. The workshop grew cold as the sun dipped below the gabled roofs of the town. But Hans did not light another lamp. He preferred the twilight. In the dimming world, the properties of the glass became more pronounced. He sat at his stool, his breath hitching in his chest. He took a second lens, this one ground with a different arc, a concave depression that felt like a shallow valley under his thumb. He had spent months experimenting with these pairings, driven by a nameless intuition that light was not a static thing, but a fluid that could be bent, channeled, and perhaps tamed. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. It was the exhaustion, he told himself, or the hunger he had ignored since dawn. But deep down, he knew it was the weight of the threshold. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a great, silent cliff. The lenses were cold against his skin, two frozen drops of water that refused to melt. He began to clean them with a scrap of silk, rubbing away the last remnants of the grinding paste until they were so clear they seemed to disappear between his fingers. If he looked at them directly, they were invisible. He could only see them by the way they distorted the world behind them, warping the lines of the timber walls into strange, surreal waves. He thought of the centuries of eyes that had come before him, the philosophers who argued that sight was a fire leaping from the pupil, the sailors who squinted at the horizon until their eyes wept salt. They had all accepted the limit. They had all lived within the cage of the naked eye, seeing only what the great architect had permitted. But here, in the silence of a workshop covered in dust, Hans felt a flicker of defiance. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to change how the world entered the soul. He picked up a scrap of leather and a small wooden ring, beginning to fashion a temporary mount for the two pieces of glass. His movements were frantic now, the slow caution of the day replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. The wax he used to seat the glass was still warm, smelling of honey and the earth. He aligned them, one in front of the other, peering through the transparency. The world jumped. For a fraction of a second, the wood grain on the far wall became a forest of towering ridges. He gasped, pulling back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence of the room felt heavier now, charged with the electricity of a discovery that had no name. He was a simple craftsman, a man of sand and fire, yet he had stumbled upon a crack in the wall of perception. He looked at the lenses again. They were no longer just objects. They were an invitation. He realized that the curve he had spent weeks perfecting was not just a shape, it was a bridge. He sat back, the shadows of the workshop lengthening until they swallowed the corners of the room, leaving him alone with the two pieces of glass that seemed to glow with a light of their own. He had not yet looked at the stars, nor the distant ships, but he knew with a terrifying certainty that the world he had known his entire life was about to become very, very small. The stillness of the workshop was now a living thing, a heavy curtain of anticipation that pressed against the back of Hans's neck. He sat motionless, the two lenses held in a precarious alignment between his stained fingers. The candle on the workbench had guttered down to a thick pool of wax, its flame a tiny, desperate orange tongue that licked at the dark. But Hans was not looking at the flame. He was looking at the way the light from that flame behaved as it encountered the glass. It did not simply pass through. It seemed to hesitate, to thicken, and then to pivot with a silent, mathematical grace. He held the convex lens, the one that bulged like a ripening fruit, near the candlelight. On the lime-washed wall behind it, a ghost appeared. It was an image of the candle flame, but it was inverted, dancing upside down in a defiant reversal of gravity. He moved the glass closer to the wall, then further away, watching as the phantom flame sharpened into a searing point of light and then dissolved into a soft, golden blur. This was the first mystery. The glass was a thief of direction. It took the straight, honest rays of light and forced them to converge, squeezing the essence of a room into a single, burning heartbeat of luminescence. He began to breathe in time with the flickering shadow. He had spent his life thinking of light as a constant, a universal bath that simply revealed what was already there. Now he saw it as a medium as malleable as the glass itself. He picked up the second lens, the concave one with the hollowed center, and placed it behind the first. The air seemed to ripple. When he looked through the pairing, the world did not just change, it folded. The light was being manipulated in a complex dance of refraction. As the rays entered the first curve, they bent inward, racing toward a meeting point that existed in the empty air between his hands. But before they could collide and flip the world upside down, the second lens intercepted them. It caught the converging light and straightened it, stretching the image back out before it reached his pupil. It was a violent, silent collision of geometry. He felt a phantom pressure in his eyes, a strain that was not physical but spiritual. The light was being forced to do work it was never intended to do. It was being compressed, packed tightly into the narrow tunnel of his vision, carrying with it a density of information that the human brain was not designed to process. He watched a single mote of dust drift through a beam of moonlight near the window. Through the glass, that speck of debris was no longer a negligible bit of gray. It was a shimmering, crystalline structure, faceted and sharp, a tiny planet tumbling through a void. He realized then that the glass was not just magnifying, it was translating. It was taking a language written in the distance, a language of faint glimmers and hazy outlines, and translating it into the bold, vibrant dialect of the foreground. He moved his head slightly, and the world through the lenses smeared like wet paint. The edges of his vision fringed with colors that shouldn't be there, faint halos of violet and rings of amber that clung to the rims of objects. It was as if the light were being shattered into its constituent parts, the glass acting as a prism that bled the secret colors of the sun. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked toward the window. He didn't open it yet. He looked through the leaded panes of the workshop window panes that were themselves wavy and full of imperfections. Even through these crude barriers, the power of his hand-ground lenses was undeniable. He held them up to a spider's web stretched across the corner of the frame. The silk threads, normally invisible in the gloom, became thick as ropes, glistening with a wet, silver dew. He could see the individual droplets, each one a perfect sphere, each one acting as a tiny lens of its own, reflecting the entire workshop in miniature. The complexity of it was overwhelming. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vertigo. If the light could be bent this way, if the small could be made large, then what happened to the concept of distance? If he could pull the far-off world toward him, was he moving toward the world, or was he dragging the world into his lap? The boundaries of his physical body felt less certain. His reach was no longer limited by the length of his arm. His reach was now as long as the light itself. He adjusted the distance between the two lenses by a fraction of a millimeter, the width of a hair. The clarity that snapped into place was so sudden it felt like a physical blow to his forehead. The texture of the stone sill, the grain of the wood, the very pores of his own skin when he brought his hand into view, everything was shouting its presence. The world was too loud. It was too detailed. He had spent his life in a comfortable fog, and now the fog was being burned away by the sheer force of redirected light. He sat back down in the darkness, the lenses resting on the velvet cloth. He thought about the way the light bent, the refraction. It was a word he knew from the scholars, but seeing it was different. It was the bending of the path. It was the realization that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, but the most revealing distance was a curve. He felt a strange kinship with the light. Like him, it was being diverted from its natural course. Like him, it was being focused into a narrow, intense purpose. The strange way the light bent through the glass was not just a trick of the trade. It was a fundamental shift in the hierarchy of the senses. The eye was no longer a passive receiver. With these tools, the eye became an active hunter. It could reach out into the gloom and seize a ray of light, twisting it, turning it, and demanding that it reveal its secrets. Hans looked at the dark shape of the town cathedral in the distance, its spire a mere needle against the navy sky. He felt the weight of the lenses in his pocket. He knew that the light coming from that spire was hitting the glass even now, waiting to be bent, waiting to be mastered. The mystery of the glass was the mystery of the threshold. He was standing between the world as it appeared and the world as it truly was. And as the moon began to rise, casting a cold, silver glow over his grinding stones, he knew he could no longer remain in the shadows of the scene. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like a wet shroud, dampening the sounds of the waking town. Hans stood at the narrow aperture of his second-story window, the wooden shutters thrown wide to the biting air. In his hands, he held a crude assembly, a length of parchment rolled into a stiff cylinder, held together by beeswax and twine. Inside this makeshift tunnel, he had fixed his two best lenses, aligned with the agonizing precision he had discovered in the candlelight of the previous night. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. To the neighbors below, he was merely a spectacle maker catching the morning light. But Hans felt like a man about to step off the map of the known world. He lifted the tube to his eye. The first sensation was one of violent disorientation. The world within the circle of the glass was a chaotic swirl of gray and green, a blurred vortex that made his stomach heave. He adjusted his grip, sliding the inner parchment sleeve outward by the width of a fingernail. The blur shuddered. He moved it again, slower this time. His breath held until his lungs burned. Suddenly, the universe snapped into a terrifying, crystalline focus. In the distance, nearly a league away, stood the weather vane atop the harbor master's tower. To the naked eye, it was a mere speck, a dark flea frozen against the pale sky. But through the tube, it was a monstrous golden beast. Hans could see the individual scratches on its brass surface. He could see the way the sea salt had pitted the metal, turning the edges to a crusty, oxidized green. Most startling of all, he could see a single spider's thread caught on the vene's beak, whipping violently in a wind that he could not even feel on his own cheek. He let out a jagged breath, nearly dropping the instrument. The distance had collapsed. The space between his window and the harbor, a space that would take a man 20 minutes of brisk walking to traverse, had been erased in an instant. It was as if he had reached out across the rooftops with a giant's hand and plucked the tower from the earth, holding it inches from his face. The physical laws of the world felt broken. He looked away from the tube, blinking at the horizon. The tower was small again, distant and unreachable. He looked through the glass, and it leapt forward, aggressive and intimate. He swung the tube toward the harbor itself. The masts of the fishing fleet, usually a tangled thicket of brown needles, were transformed into a forest of weathered timber. He could see the frayed fibers of the hempen ropes, the dark dampness of the wood where the spray had hit the hull, and the rhythmic rise and fall of the water against the barnacles. He saw a sailor leaning against a mast, a man whose name he would never know. Through the glass, he could see the man's weathered skin, the squint of his eyes against the morning glare, and the way he wiped a hand across his brow. A profound sense of intrusion washed over Hans. He was seeing things he had no right to see. He was a phantom, an invisible presence standing on the shoulder of a man a mile away. This was the true power of the instrument. It was a thief of privacy, a tool that ignored the sanctuary of distance. The world was no longer protected by its vastness. The horizon, which had always been the boundary of human influence, was now just a curtain waiting to be pulled back. He turned the tube toward the marketplace. He saw the texture of the bread being unloaded from a cart, the dusting of white flour on the dark crust. He saw the flash of a silver coin passing between hands, a transaction so distant it should have been a silent abstraction. Yet he could see the mint mark on the metal. He began to tremble, not from the cold, but from the realization of scale. If the small could be made large, and the far could be made near, then what was the true size of anything? The people in the street below were moving in their slow, oblivious orbits, unaware that their world had just been pierced. Hans felt a heavy loneliness. He was the only person in the city, perhaps the only person in the world, who truly saw the harbor master's tower in that moment. To everyone else, it was a landmark in the background of their lives. To him, it was a testament to the fact that the human eye was a liar. It told us the world was small and manageable. It told us that what we couldn't see clearly didn't exist in detail. He leaned his forehead against the cold stone of the window frame, the tube still pressed to his eye. He watched a gull take flight from a chimney pot. Usually, a bird in flight was a graceful, blurred arc. Through the glass, it was a mechanical marvel. He could see the individual feathers separating like fingers to catch the air. He could see the amber ring of its eye and the slight twitch of its talons. The bird was not just flying. It was navigating a complex, invisible sea of wind, and Hans was there, riding alongside it. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and flooding the world with a harsh, uncompromising light. The more light there was, the more the lenses demanded. They drank in the morning, gorging on the details of the world. Hans felt a growing hunger that he knew would never be satisfied. The harbor was not enough. The tower was not enough. The distant hills, which now showed the individual sheep grazing like white stones on a green cloth, were not enough. He looked at the tube, this humble assembly of glass and paper. It was a key. It didn't just pull objects closer. It pulled the soul further out. He realized that he could no longer live in the world of the naked eye. It would be like living in a room with the lamps extinguished after having seen the light. He was no longer a craftsman of spectacles. He was an explorer of the reach. He stood there for hours, a silent sentinel at his window, dragging the distant world toward him piece by piece, until the shadows began to turn and the first hint of evening suggested a new, even more distant frontier. The transition from day to night brought with it a different kind of silence, one that felt heavier, more expectant. Hans no longer looked at the bustling harbor or the textured stone of the town's cathedral. As the blue hour surrendered to a deep, bruised indigo, he turned his gaze upward. He had spent the afternoon refining the instrument, discarding the fragile parchment for a more permanent housing, a tube of seasoned wood, blackened on the inside with soot to swallow any stray reflections that might tarnish the purity of the light. Felt solid in his hands, a weight of intent. He moved to the small balcony that jutted out from the attic, away from the flickering grease lamps of the street. The night was crisp, the air settled and still, free of the thermal shimmers that had blurred his vision during the heat of the day. Above him, the sky was a familiar tapestry, the same one he had looked upon since he was a child. He knew the constellations as static myths, the hunter, the bear, the queen, unchanging beacons that served as a clock for the seasons and a map for the lost. To the naked eye, the stars were mere pinpricks, tiny punctures in the velvet dome of the firmament through which the celestial light of the heavens leaked. He braced the tube against the wooden railing, his pulse thrumming in his fingertips. He didn't aim for a star yet, he aimed for the void between them, a patch of absolute blackness where the eye saw nothing but the absence of God. As he pressed his eye to the glass, the darkness did not remain dark. The first thing he noticed was the sheer volume of light. The lenses were not just magnifying, they were gathering. They were acting as a wider pupil, a larger bucket to catch the rain of photons falling from the abyss. In that patch of nothing, a dozen tiny sparks appeared, shivering with a cold, white intensity. They were stars that had existed for an eternity, yet had never once been witnessed by a human being. They were the hidden population of the universe, emerging from the shadows like ghosts summoned by a medium. He felt a wave of profound insignificance wash over him. The sky was crowded. For every star he could see with his unaided eyes, the tube revealed 100 more, a dense thicket of light that made the familiar constellations seem like sparse, lonely outposts. He moved the tube slowly, a blind man feeling his way across a room of diamonds. The motion was liquid, the stars drifting across the circular field of vision like glowing embers caught in a slow-motion current. Then he tilted the tube higher, toward the great hunter's belt. He had expected to see the stars as larger disks, perhaps like small moons, but the glass revealed a different truth. No matter how much he magnified them, the stars remained points. They were infinitely distant, so far away that the power of his hand-ground glass could not give them body, only brightness. They were not objects to be visited. They were signals from a distance so vast it defied the human capacity for measurement. The tube felt like a weapon in his hands, a tool of desecration. For centuries, the heavens had been the realm of the perfect, the untouchable, and the divine. By pointing a mechanical device at the sky, Hans was breaking a fundamental covenant. He was treating the heavens like a workshop, like a harbor, like a thing that could be inspected and analyzed. The mystery of the night was being replaced by the scrutiny of the lens. He found a cluster of stars, a tiny, shimmering knot of light that usually looked like a faint smudge of cloud. Through the tube, it exploded into a dazzling jewelry box of blue-white fire. He could see the individual members of the group, held together by some invisible, silent tether. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. It suggested a universe of such complexity and scale that the mind felt itself beginning to fray at the edges. If there was this much light where he thought there was none, then how much more remained hidden? His eye began to ache, the muscles around his socket cramping from the intensity of his stare. But he could not pull away. The tube was a tether to a reality that made his own life his workshop. His debts, his very name, seemed like a momentary flicker of a candle in a gale. He was the first to see the sky as a three-dimensional abyss rather than a painted ceiling. He could feel the depth. He could feel the terrifying layers of the cosmos, star behind star, light behind light, stretching back into a past that predated the first human word. He stayed there until his limbs were numb with cold, the wooden tube resting against his brow like a third eye. He had set out to build a tool for sailors and generals, a device to see the enemy's campfire or the merchant's sail. Instead, he had built a bridge into the infinite. As he finally lowered the instrument, the world around him felt suffocatingly small. The narrow street, the familiar rooftops, the solid ground beneath his feet. It all felt like a fragile raft floating on a vast, dark sea of stars. He looked up one last time with his naked eye, and for the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of the silence above. The moon rose late, a bloated, amber orb that seemed to struggle as it cleared the jagged line of the horizon. To the poets and the priests, it was the lesser light, a perfect, ethereal sphere of celestial pearl, unblemished and divine. It was a mirror of the soul, a silver disk that governed the tides and the madness of men. Hans waited for it to climb higher, into the thin, cold air where the atmosphere was at its most transparent. He adjusted the wooden tripod he had built to steady the tube, for even the vibration of his own heartbeat now felt like an earthquake through the glass. He leaned in, closing his left eye and pressing his right against the cold rim of the lens. The shock was physical, he recoiled, his hand flying to his chest, the breath trapped in his throat. He had expected to see a brighter version of the familiar face, the man in the moon, the soft, blurry shadows he had known since childhood. Instead, he saw a world. It was not a light, it was a place. It was a landscape of violence and desolation, a desert of bone-white rock and charcoal-gray dust. Through the tube, the moon was no longer a flat disk. It had depth, it had texture. He could see the curvature of its body, the way the light from the sun grazed its surface at an oblique angle, casting long, ink-black shadows that stretched across vast, empty plains. The boundary between the light and the dark, the Terminator, was not a smooth line. It was a jagged, broken edge, a serrated saw blade of mountain peaks and crater rims that caught the sun while the valleys below remained plunged in a night as deep as the grave. He followed the line of the Terminator, his eye tracing the spine of a mountain range that looked as rugged and formidable as the Alps. These were not celestial ornaments. They were piles of stone, ridges of ancient, silent rock that reached up into the vacuum. He saw craters, thousands of them, ranging from tiny pockmarks to vast, circular arenas with central peaks that rose like frozen waves. They looked like scars on a skin that had been beaten by a rain of fire. The moon was dead. That was the realization that chilled his marrow more than the night air. It was a silent, airless wasteland of magnificent, terrifying scale. He saw the seas, the vast, dark expanses that humans had named in their ignorance, and realized they were not water at all. They were frozen oceans of basalt, smooth and desolate, where nothing moved and nothing lived. The perfection of the heavens was a lie. The moon was as flawed, as rugged, and as physical as the earth beneath his boots. He watched a single crater on the edge of the darkness. As the moon moved, a tiny sliver of sunlight touched the very tip of its western rim. He watched, mesmerized, as the light slowly spilled down the inner wall of the basin, revealing the terraced cliffs and the rubble-strewn floor. He was watching the sun rise on another world. He was a witness to a morning that no lungs would ever breathe, a dawn that broke over a silent kingdom of dust. A profound sense of vertigo seized him. If the moon was a world, with mountains and valleys and plains, then what was the earth? Was it merely another cold rock suspended in the dark? He felt the hierarchy of the universe collapsing. The divide between the corrupt earth and the perfect heavens was dissolving before his very eyes. The moon was not a god, nor a symbol, nor a light. It was a sister, a battered, lonely sibling of the world he inhabited. He thought of the people sleeping in the houses below him, dreaming of a sky made of crystal spheres and angelic music. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to shout to them, to drag them from their beds and force them to look. He wanted them to see the craters, to see the shadows of the mountains, to see the evidence that the universe was far more ancient and indifferent than they had ever dared to imagine. But he remained silent. He knew that to see this was to lose a certain kind of peace. Once you saw the moon as a world, you could never again look at the night sky and feel the same comfort of being watched over. He stayed at the lens until the moon moved out of his field of vision, its slow, majestic transit across the sky leaving him behind in the dark. He didn't move to find it again. He sat in the chair, his eyes wide, staring at the empty air. The silver light of the moon bathed the workshop, casting shadows that now looked like the craters he had just seen. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had ground the glass, and they looked alien to him. He was a creature of the earth, yet his mind was now a resident of the lunar planes. He had seen the forbidden geography, and the weight of that sight felt like a mountain of stone resting upon his heart. The cold of the deep night had begun to seep into the very marrow of his bones, but Hans felt a feverish heat behind his eyes. The discovery of the moon's rugged face had acted as a catalyst, a breaking of the final seal. He no longer approached the telescope with the tentative curiosity of a craftsman. He approached it with the hunger of a man seeking the limits of the possible. He turned the tube away from the silver glare of the lunar plains, seeking the darkest reaches of the sky, where the constellations held their traditional shapes in a fragile, sparse geometry. He pointed the instrument toward the cluster known as the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, which to the naked eye were a dainty, shimmering thumbprint of light. Through the glass, the thumbprint exploded into a galaxy. Where the human eye saw 7 lanterns, the telescope revealed scores, hundreds of blue-white diamonds scattered like salt across a black velvet table. They were not merely brighter, they were new. These were the invisible stars, the ones that had burned in the silence of the void since the beginning of time, their light traveling through the unthinkable reaches of space only to be ignored by every generation of humanity that had ever lived. Hans felt a lump form in his throat. It was an overwhelming realization. The universe was crowded. The darkness between the familiar stars was a lie told by the limitations of the human pupil. He moved the tube slowly, panning across the Milky Way, the great river of the sky. To the unaided eye, it was a soft, milky smear, a celestial mist that suggested the breath of a god or a trail of divine dust. But as the lenses drank in the light, the mist vanished. In its place stood a terrifying density of stars. They were packed so tightly in the field of view that they resembled the grains of sand in the very hourglass that sat on his workbench. There were thousands upon thousands of them, a carpet of light so thick that the blackness of the sky seemed to be replaced by a shimmering golden fog of suns. The sheer scale of it was suffocating. He tried to count them, but the task was impossible. For every star he focused on, 10 more appeared in the periphery of the lens. He was looking at the structure of the universe itself, the skeleton of the cosmos. He realized that the darkness of night was merely a veil of distance. If the human eye were powerful enough, there would be no night at all. The sky would be a solid wall of fire, a blinding radiance of infinite suns overlapping in the deep. He began to see colors he had never associated with the night. Some stars burned with a cold, piercing sapphire light. Others were as orange as a dying ember or as red as a drop of blood on snow. The variety was a testament to a diversity he had never been taught. The heavens were not a uniform, static backdrop. They were a vibrant, chaotic, and unimaginably vast collection of individuals. He felt a sense of profound vertigo, as if the earth had suddenly dropped away from beneath his feet, leaving him plummeting into a sea of light that had no bottom and no shore. He thought of the maps in the great libraries, the charts that carefully plotted the positions of the fixed stars as if they were the final boundaries of the world. Those maps were now obsolete. They were the drawings of children. He was looking at a map that could never be finished, a ledger of light that grew longer with every refinement of the lens. He felt a strange, prickly fear. To see new stars appearing where darkness once was felt like a transgression against the order of things. If the authorities, the men of the cloth and the masters of the universities, knew that the sky was this crowded, what would happen to their tidy, centered world? He looked away from the tube for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the natural darkness. The sky looked empty. It looked lonely. The contrast was agonizing. He knew that the stars were there. He could feel them pressing against the atmosphere, their light raining down in a silent, invisible deluge. To see the truth through the glass and then to look back at the normal world was to feel like a man who had seen the sun and was now forced to live in a cave. He returned to the lens, finding a patch of sky near the belt of the hunter. He focused on a small, fuzzy patch of light that had always been dismissed as a distant cloud. Through the tube, it was no longer a cloud. It was a swirling, ethereal nebula, a ghostly veil of light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was a nursery or perhaps a graveyard, he didn't know which, but it was proof that the heavens were not made of immutable crystal. There was movement there was change. There was a process of creation and decay that mirrored the world of men, yet operated on a scale that made a human lifetime seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. He stayed there until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, washing out the faintest of his new stars. One by one, the ghosts retreated into the blue. Hans watched them go with a sense of mourning. He had spent the night in the company of the infinite, and the return to the world of the sun felt like a descent into a smaller, more restrictive room. He pulled the wooden tube back inside and closed the shutters, but the darkness of the workshop was no longer dark. It was filled with the memory of the thousands of eyes that had watched him back from the deep, the new stars that now lived inside his mind, forever changing the way he understood the meaning of a clear night. The sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally altered, yet Hans found he could not sleep. The light of day, once his greatest ally in the workshop, now felt like a thick, opaque curtain drawn across the true reality of the cosmos. He spent the daylight hours in a state of restless agitation, his mind reeling from the implications of the invisible stars. As the evening returned, a new sensation began to eclipse his curiosity, a cold, gnawing fear. It was not the fear of the dark, but a fear of the light, specifically the light that revealed a universe so vast it threatened to swallow the human soul whole. He returned to his balcony, but his movements were slower, more hesitant. He realized that every time he looked through the tube, he was dismantling a piece of his own certainty. For his entire life, the universe had been a small, structured place. The earth was the heavy, solid center, and the heavens were a series of nested spheres, like the layers of an onion, designed specifically to revolve around the drama of human existence. It was a comforting architecture. It made every prayer feel heard and every action feel significant. But the telescope was a wrecking ball swung at the walls of that sanctuary. He pointed the tube toward the planet Jupiter, which hung like a bright, steady jewel in the south. To the naked eye, it was a kingly light, a wandering star that followed a predictable path across the zodiac. But as Hans adjusted the focus, the jewel transformed into a pale, cream-colored disk. It had a physical dimension. It was a sphere, suspended in the nothingness. And there, flanking it in a perfect straight line, were 4 tiny stars that he had never noticed before. He watched them for hours, his brow furrowed. At first, he thought they were merely more of the invisible stars he had discovered the night before. But as the hours passed, he realized with a jolt of terror that they were moving. They were not moving with the rest of the fixed stars. They were moving with Jupiter. They were circling it. They were dancers in a private celestial ballroom, tethered to the giant planet by a bond he could not see but could certainly measure. The implications hit him with the force of a physical blow. If these bodies were circling Jupiter, then not everything in the heavens revolved around the Earth. The central pillar of human belief, the idea that we were the sole pivot point of the great architect's design, was crumbling. If Jupiter had its own attendants, its own miniature system of worlds, then the Earth was not unique. It was not the throne of the universe. It was merely another actor on a much larger, much more indifferent stage. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He felt a sudden, frantic urge to dismantle the telescope, to smash the lenses back into the sand from which they came. There was a reason the human eye had limits, he thought. Perhaps we were not meant to see this. Perhaps the fog of our natural vision was a mercy, a protective veil that kept us from realizing how lonely and small we truly were. To see the universe as it really was, vast, decentralized, and populated by worlds that didn't care about the affairs of men, was a burden that felt too heavy for a single heart to carry. He looked down at the town below. He saw the flickering hearth fires and heard the distant chime of the cathedral bell. Those people lived in a world of meaning. They believed the stars were put there to guide their ships and the moon was there to light their way. They believed they were the center of a grand, divine attention. Hans felt like a man who had discovered a terrible secret about a loved one. A secret he could never tell, but one that changed everything forever. He felt a profound sense of isolation. He was no longer part of the community of the seen. He was a citizen of the known, and the known was a terrifying, empty place. The wonder he had felt the previous nights was now tinged with a deep, existential dread. The beauty of the stars felt colder, more piercing. They were no longer the heavens, they were space. The word itself felt like an intake of breath in a vacuum. He realized that the more he saw, the less he understood his own place in the fabric of reality. He was a speck of dust on a larger speck of dust, hurtling through a dark gallery of suns that would continue to burn long after his name, his language, and his species had vanished into the silence. He leaned against the cold wood of the telescope, his eyes wet with tears he couldn't quite explain. It was a grief for the lost intimacy of the world. He had traded a cozy, meaningful myth for a cold, magnificent truth. He felt the weight of the infinite pressing down on his shoulders, a gravity of scale that made his very bones feel brittle. Yet, even in his fear, he could not turn away. The terror was inseparable from the awe. He was afraid of the universe, yes, but he was also hopelessly, dangerously in love with the fact that he was the one looking at it. He realized that humanity's true dignity did not come from being the center of the world, but from having the courage to look into the abyss and demand to know its shape. The dread that had settled in Hans's chest did not paralyze him. Instead, it transformed into a cold, methodical resolve. If the universe was a vast and indifferent sea, then he would not be a drowning man. He would be a cartographer. He returned to his workshop not to grind more glass, but to find a way to record the impossible. He cleared his workbench of its rouge and polishing cloths, replacing them with thick sheaves of vellum, sharpened quills, and ink as black as the midnight sky. He realized that the seen word was fleeting, but the recorded word, the map, was an anchor. Night after night, he began the grueling process of translation. He would sit for hours at the eyepiece, his neck stiff and his eyes weeping from the strain. Then he would turn to the paper to scratch out a series of dots and arcs. He was no longer just looking, he was measuring. He began to chart the positions of the new stars, using the familiar constellations as a skeletal frame upon which he hung the hidden jewels of the deep. He developed a shorthand for brightness, a language of cross-hatched lines to represent the nebulous mists, and a precise geometry to track the wandering path of the planets. The sky, once a chaotic sprawl of myth, was becoming a grid. He felt a strange, quiet power in this. To name a thing, to plot its coordinates, was to bring it within the realm of human understanding. He was domesticating the infinite. He spent an entire week focused solely on the Pleiades, mapping the relative distances between the sapphire suns until the vellum looked like a field of frozen fire. He moved to the belt of the hunter, then to the Great Bear, filling page after page with the intricate, crowded reality of the night. He noticed things that had escaped him in his earlier, more emotional observations. He saw that the stars were not randomly scattered but seemed to cluster in great, sweeping rivers and islands. He saw that the planets moved against the background of the stars with a mathematical precision that suggested a clockwork of unimaginable scale. The wandering stars were not wandering at all. They were following tracks laid down by a geometry so perfect it made the finest craftsmanship of man look crude and clumsy. The act of mapping changed his relationship with the sky. The fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, intellectual intimacy. The universe was no longer a terrifying abyss. It was a library. Every star was a word, every constellation a sentence, and the entire night sky was a vast, ancient book that humanity had been trying to read through a dirty window for 10,000 years. Now, with the telescope, the window was clean. He was reading the original text of creation, a text written in the language of light and distance. He began to notice the subtle variations in the celestial geography. He saw how the light of a star would twinkle and shift as it passed through the different layers of the Earth's breath, and how the planets, being closer and more substantial, held their steady, unblinking glow. He mapped the shadows of the lunar craters as they moved with the phases, calculating the heights of the mountains from the lengths of their shadows. He was a surveyor of a land where no foot would ever tread, a pioneer of a territory that had no air. As his maps grew more complex, he realized that he was creating a new kind of history before the telescope. The sky was a place of timeless perfection, a realm where nothing ever changed. But his maps showed a different story. He recorded the appearance of a comet, a ghostly, trailing visitor that cut across the established paths of the planets. It was a jagged, irregular event in a world of circles. It proved that the sky was not a finished work. It was a living, breathing process. There was weather in the heavens. There were storms of light and droughts of darkness. He felt a sense of immense responsibility. These maps were not just for him. They were for the generations that would follow, the sailors who would use these new stars to find their way across uncharted oceans, the philosophers who would use this data to rebuild their understanding of God, and the dreamers who would one day look at his sketches and realize that the Earth was just one small island in a vast archipelago of worlds. He worked until his ink-stained fingers were too cramped to hold the quill. The stacks of vellum in his workshop were now a parallel universe, a paper reflection of the diamond-studded vault above. He had taken the measure of the stars. He had turned the terrifying distance into a series of reachable points. The sky was no longer a mystery to be feared. It was a map to be followed. As he blew the wet ink dry on his final chart of the Jovian moons, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he first held the curved glass. He had seen the infinite, and he had found its rhythm. He had turned the silence into a song of numbers and lines. And in doing so, he had given humanity a way to walk among the stars without ever leaving the ground. The maps laid out across the workbench were more than just ink and vellum. They were a confession. As Hans looked upon the accumulated data of months, the plotted orbits of Jupiter's moons, the rugged, Earth-like scars of the lunar surface, and the dense, crowded corridors of the Milky Way, the final, most devastating truth settled over him. It was a truth that did not require a telescope to see anymore. It lived in the cold logic of the geometry he had recorded. The Earth, this heavy, solid foundation of all human history, was moving. He sat in the center of his darkened workshop, the silence of the room suddenly feeling like the interior of a spinning top. For all of human memory, the ground was the absolute. Men built their cathedrals and their fortresses upon it with the certainty that it was the unmoving footstool of the divine. But the glass had betrayed that comfort. If Jupiter was a center of motion for its own satellites, And if the phases of the planets shifted like the phases of the moon, then the old arrangements were impossible. The sun was not a golden chariot circling the human stage. It was the great, burning anchor, and the Earth was merely a passenger, a spinning marble caught in its gravitational wake. The realization brought with it a sense of profound, physical displacement. He felt the phantom wind of the Earth's motion. He looked at the floorboards beneath his feet and imagined them not as a solid floor, but as a precarious deck of a ship hurtling through a vacuum at a speed the mind could not conceive. Humanity was not the audience in a theater built for their benefit. They were not even the protagonists. They were inhabitants of a wandering spark, lost in a cathedral of a billion other sparks. This was the death of the center. To be at the center was to be important. To be at the center was to be watched, judged, and protected. To be cast out into the wide, revolving tracks of the solar system was to be orphaned. Hans thought of the priests who would call this heresy, and the scholars who would call it madness. They would cling to the old circles because the old circles kept them safe. They wanted a universe that was a house with walls and a ceiling. Hans was looking at a universe that had no walls, a house that was all windows, looking out onto an eternity that didn't know his name. He picked up a globe of the Earth he had purchased years ago. It was a beautiful thing, painted with gold leaf and vibrant blues. He turned it slowly in his hands. He used to look at it and see the whole of reality. Now he saw it as a fragment. He saw it as a small, fragile vessel of air and water, shielded from the lethal radiation of the deep only by a thin, invisible veil. It was a miracle, but not the kind of miracle he had been taught. The miracle wasn't that the universe was made for man. The miracle was that man had survived long enough to build a tool that could see how much the universe didn't care about him. He felt a strange, new humility. It was a shedding of the ego, both personal and collective. The pride of the kings, the squabbles of the nations, the borders drawn in blood. How insignificant they were when viewed from the perspective of the Jovian moons. From the height of the stars he had mapped, the entire history of his species was a frantic, microscopic bustle on a speck of dust. He wasn't saddened by this. Rather, he felt a liberating sense of lightness. If the Earth was not the center, then the burdens of the center were gone. The heavy expectations of being the apex of creation vanished, replaced by a sense of kinship with the rest of the cosmos. He walked to the window and looked out at the town one last time. He saw a mother carrying a child, a baker hauling a tray of loaves, a dog barking at a shadow. They were all moving together, riding the same great, silent curve through the dark. They were all astronauts, though they would never use the word. They were all travelers on a journey that had no destination other than the continuation of the journey itself. He felt a sudden, fierce love for them, for their smallness, for their ignorance, and for their stubborn, beautiful persistence in a universe that offered no guarantees. He realized that the telescope had not just moved the stars closer. It had pushed the Earth further away. It had given humanity the perspective of a god, but the body of a peasant. We were the only part of the universe that had turned around to look at itself. We were the eyes of the cosmos, the way the vast, silent machinery of the stars finally achieved a voice. He put his quill down. The mapping was finished. The center was gone. But in its place, he found something better. A sense of belonging to a whole so large that even his fear had a home within it. The workshop was now a graveyard of old certainties. Yet in the soft, lavender light of his final dawn at the bench, Hans felt a clarity that transcended the fatigue of his body. He looked at the wooden tube, resting silently among the ink-stained maps and the piles of glass shavings. It was such a simple thing, a combination of sand, fire, and wood, and yet it had functioned as a lens for the human soul. It had been the bridge across the impossible, a narrow tunnel through which the infinite had been forced to speak. He realized then that the act of seeing was not a passive reception of the world, but a courageous act of reaching. To see was to bridge the distance, Since the first human looked up and wondered at the fire in the sky, we had been a species defined by our reach. We had walked across continents, crossed oceans in fragile hulls, and built towers of stone to touch the clouds. But the telescope had granted us a new kind of movement, a travel of the mind. Distance, he understood now, was not a wall. It was a density of time. To look at the stars was to look backward into a history that preceded the mountains and the seas. We were peering into the very furnace of creation, watching the light of 1,000 yesterdays arrive on our doorstep today. The infinite was no longer a philosophical abstraction. It was a physical reality, a cold and magnificent ocean of space that stretched out in every direction, seemingly without end. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a profound liberation. If the universe was infinite, then the potential for discovery was also infinite. There would always be another star, another world, another mystery waiting just beyond the current limit of our glass. We had not reached the end of the map. We had simply discovered that the map has no edges. We were a people who would forever be standing on the shore of a new ocean, squinting at the horizon, waiting for the light to tell us what came next. Hans picked up a small, discarded lens and held it up to the morning sun. A bright, focused point of light appeared on his palm, warm and intense. He thought about the journey that light had taken, the millions of miles traversed in an instant, only to be captured and concentrated by a piece of curved glass. This was the human condition, to be a small, fragile vessel capable of holding the weight of the stars. We are the architects of our own perspective. We are the only creatures who can measure the vastness of our own insignificance and, in that very act, become something greater. The telescope had taught him that seeing is not just about the eyes. It is about the courage to accept what is seen. It is the willingness to let go of the comfortable center and embrace the wandering path. It is the realization that we are made of the same stuff as the stars we watch, that the iron in our blood and the calcium in our bones were forged in the same celestial fires that now shimmered in the eyepiece of his instrument. We are not separate from the universe, looking in through a window. We are the universe looking back at itself, trying to understand the rhythm of its own heart. As the town began to wake, the sound of shutters opening, the clatter of hooves on stone, the call of the morning birds, Hans felt a quiet sense of completion. The secret was out. The glass had been ground, the tube had been built, and the sky had been opened. Even if he were to destroy his workshop and burn his maps, the vision would remain. It would spread like a slow, inevitable tide, passing from mind to mind, from lens to lens, until every eye on Earth had been invited to look beyond the limits of the naked eye. The cage of the horizon had been broken forever. He stood one last time at the window, not looking through the tube, but simply looking out at the waking world. The distance between him and the farthest star felt no longer like a void, but like a thread. He was connected to the infinite by the mere act of witness. The universe was vast, cold, and ancient, but it was no longer silent. It was a conversation, and he had heard the first few notes of the melody. He closed his eyes, and even in the darkness behind his lids, he could see the shimmering clusters, the craters of the moon, and the dancing moons of Jupiter, all spinning in their silent, majestic harmony. We are a species of seekers, Hans thought, and we have finally found our way out. The journey of seeing had only just begun. From this moment on, humanity would never be the same. We would be a people of the lens, a people of the reach, forever defined by our refusal to accept that the sky has a limit. He left the telescope on the tripod, a silent sentinel pointed toward the future, and stepped away from the bench, leaving the workshop to the morning light. A light that was no longer just a way to see the room, but a way to see everything.